Most people make a fatal mistake when they encounter someone with deep empathy. They see softness and assume fragility. They witness patience and confuse it with passivity. They watch someone forgive and believe they've won. They interpret emotional kindness as emotional ignorance. But here's the truth they never see coming. Empaths aren't fragile because they feel everything. They're unbreakable because they survive emotional storms that would shatter most people, breaking entirely. And the moment you push an empathetic person past not all at once, not with noise, not with drama, not all at once, quietly, coldly, permanently. Because the most dangerous version of an empath isn't the one who feels too much. It's the one who's learned to feel nothing at all. You need to understand something. Empathetic people are constantly studying human behavior. Even when they're silent, they're watching everything. The change in your energy, the fake concern, the forced affection, the subtle disrespect, the manipulation wrapped in loving words. They catch what everyone else mispronounces the mind to detect inconsistencies. That's why they stay quiet longer than you'd expect. Not because they're clueless, but because they're gathering evidence, emotionally documenting every inconsistency. Most people think an empath forgives repeatedly because they're naive. Wrong. Empaths usually know the truth long before they confront it. They simply hope you'll choose honesty before the damage becomes irreversible. But repeated emotional pain rewires human psychology. At first, the empath who absorbs emotions intensely. At first, the empath will try to communicate. They'll explain how they feel. They'll attempt to fix things because emotionally intelligent people instinctively look for solutions before separation. But when their empathy is repeatedly met with manipulation, the brain begins protecting itself. And this is where the transformation starts. Slowly, the empath stops reacting emotionally. And most people completely misread this moment. They think, good, they're finally calming down. No, they're disconnecting massive psychological difference between emotional peace and emotional shutdown. Peace still holds warmth. Shutdown holds distance. And once emotional detachment begins, the relationship has already entered its final phase. Because human connection survives on emotional investment. The moment the empath stops investing emotionally, the entire structure collapses silently. What makes this dangerous is that manipulators only feel powerful when they can feed off emotional access arguments, begging, crying, explaining, defending. These reactions confirm that they still control the emotional atmosphere. But when the empath suddenly becomes calm, something terrifying logics. The control vanishes. The manipulator can no longer predict emotional responses. And unpredictability breeds anxiety. That's why emotionally abusive people often become aggressive when an empath goes quiet. Because silence removes their power. This is a crucial psychological principle. People feel uncomfortable when their emotional control over someone disappears. And empaths eventually reach a stage where they no longer seek validation from the people harming them. That moment changes everything, because emotionally detached empathy is almost impossible to manipulate. Now listen carefully. Empaths don't become heartless after pain. They become selective. That's the difference. Pain teaches pattern recognition. After enough betrayal, the empath stops ignoring red flags. They stop over-explaining themselves. They stop chasing closure. They stop forcing connection. They stop trying to save people who enjoy causing harm. And this transformation shocks everyone around them. Why? Because people become addicted to the emotional safety empaths provide. Empaths listen deeply, support consistently, forgive repeatedly, understand emotionally. Most people never realize the value of that presence until it vanishes. And when it vanishes, the emotional environment shifts immediately. Suddenly, the warmth is gone. The reassurance is gone. The emotional availability is gone. And many people experience psychological withdrawal without understanding why. Because they were consuming emotional energy they never appreciated. This is why breaking an empath often creates regret later. Not because the empath seeks revenge, but because their absence of conscience was protecting people from lack of understanding. Lack of understanding. Internal emptiness. The empath was carrying emotional weight silently the entire time. And once they stop carrying it, everyone have finally said, "Ovi truly." Here's another mistake people make. They think emotional people can't become emotionally disciplined. Actually, the opposite is often true. The deepest feelers eventually become the sharpest observers because pain sharpens awareness. An empath who survives betrayal develops extraordinary emotional control. They learn who drains energy, who performs kindness, who lies strategic charm. Because once kindness strategically, and once these patterns become visible, the empath becomes extremely difficult to deceive. This is where emotional maturity evolves into emotional power, not loud power. Controlled power, the kind that can walk away without approval, the kind that can walk away without explanation, the kind that understands silence is sometimes stronger than confrontation. That's why emotionally evolved empaths become intimidating to manipulative personalities, because manipulation only works on people desperate for emotional connection. A healed empath is no longer emotionally desperate. They can love deeply without abandoning themselves. That changes everything. Now, here's the part most people aren't prepared for. When an empath finally stops caring, it usually means they cared too much for too long. Emotional shutdown rarely happens suddenly. It happens after repeated disappointment, repeated disrespect, repeated emotional imbalance, repeated betrayal by reducing emotional attachment. Psychologists call this emotional withdrawal after prolonged stress exposure. And once this state fully develops, because the empath remembers everything emotionally, not just words, patterns, energy, behavioral consistency. And trust, once psychologically broken repeatedly, does not rebuild easily. This is why many people panic after losing an empath. They assume I can get them back later. But emotionally detached empaths often never return psychologically. Even if they return physically for a short time, emotionally they're already gone. And that realization creates regret stronger than anger ever could, because humans often ignore value while it's available. Only absence creates clarity. This message isn't about fear, it's about awareness. People must understand that empathetic individuals are not emotional tools designed for endless sacrifice. They are human beings intelligent the empath limits, and the more emotionally intelligent the empath becomes, the less tolerance they develop for manipulation disguised as love. So if you have someone in your life who loves deeply, listens consistently, and remains patient during your worst moments, don't take that lightly. Because emotional safety is rare, and once destroyed, it's almost impossible to recreate artificially. An empath can survive without the people who hurt them. Many people cannot emotionally recover from losing someone who truly understood them. That's the irony. The empath everyone underestimated because time they realize it, and by the time they realize it, the empath is already emotionally moved on. Most people completely misunderstand what happens inside an empath when they're emotionally hurt. Because the damage is rarely visible the beginning, an empath doesn't immediately become cold, distant, or angry. In fact, they often become even more patient because their natural instinct is to repair emotional tension rather than create it. That's what makes the situation psychologically dangerous. While other people react instant pain quietly and process it internally, they replay perchafere changes in their mind, study changes in behavior, notice emotional inconsistencies, and try to convince themselves that the situation can still improve. They give repeated chances not because they're weak, but because they emotionally understand human imperfection better than most people. However, every disappointment leaves a psychological mark, every ignored feeling, every manipulation disguised as love, every moment of emotional disrespect slowly exhausts the nervous system. Over time, the empath begins experiencing emotional fatigue, a condition where the mind becomes tired of carrying emotional weight for everyone else while receiving little emotional safety in return. This is the stage most people fail to recognize, because the empath still appears calm on the surface. They still communicate normally, still help others, still try to maintain peace, but internally something important is changing. The emotional energy that once flowed naturally toward the relationship begins to decrease. Their trust becomes cautious, their emotional openness becomes guarded. Their mind slowly shifts from attachment to observation. Instead of emotionally chasing connection, they begin emotionally studying distance. This transformally is extremely important because emotionally intelligent individuals don't disconnect impulsively. They disconnect after prolonged psychological disappointment. Once the empath realizes that their kindness is being exploited instead of valued, the brain starts adapting for self-protection. They stop explaining themselves repeatedly. They stop reacting emotionally to every problem. They stop begging for honesty from people who already understand the damage they're causing. At this point, many people wrongly assume the empath has become emotionally stronger for the relationship, when in reality, the empath is preparing emotionally to survive without it. The silence becomes different. The energy becomes different. That fusion because the emotional warmth that once filled every interaction slowly disappears. This is why people often realize the value of an empath too late. They become so accustomed to receiving emotional support, patience, understanding, and forgiveness that they mistake it as something permanent. They assume the empath will always remain emotionally available, regardless of how much pain they experience. But human psychology doesn't work that way. Even the most compassionate mind eventually reaches emotional exhaustion. And when an empath finally reaches that limit, the detachment becomes extremely difficult emotional pain because it was built slowly through accumulated emotional pain. By the time the empath emotionally lets go, they've already spent grieving the relationship in silence. That's why their final distance feels so calm, so controlled, so permanent, because the emotional goodbye happened internally long before the physical separation ever became visible. One of the biggest psychological mistakes people make is assuming that empathy automatically equals weakness. Many individuals believe that because an empath is patient, forgiving, emotionally expressive, or understanding, kindness means emotional dependences. They assume kindness means emotional dependency, and they mistake compassion for lack of awareness. But emotionally intelligent people operate very differently from what most manipulators expect. Empaths are constantly observing emotional patterns, even during moments when they appear silent or emotionally calm. They notice shifts in tone, passive disrespect, emotional dishonesty, manipulation hidden beneath fake affection. The reason many empaths tolerate unhealthy behavior longer than others is not because they fail to recognize it, but because they naturally search for emotional explanations before making final judgments. They try to understand pain instead of immediately condemning it. They attempt communicational manipulation changes the psychological dynamic completely. When a person continuously lies, controls, gaslights, emotionally neglects, or exploits an empath's compassion, that their emotional energy is no longer creating connection, but feeding energy is dysfunction instead. This realization becomes a turning point. Instead of emotionally reacting harder, the empath begins emotionally withdrawing. And this appealative behavior survives through emotional access. Manipulative behavior through emotional access. It depends on triggering reactions: fear, guilt, confusion explaining, emotional chasing. The manipulator feels powerful when they can influence another person's emotional state. Once the empath stops emotionally reacting the same way, the manipulator loses psychological control. That sudden calmness often confuses people because they mistake silence for weakness, when in reality, silence can become emotional detachment. The empath is no longer fighting to be understood because they've already started understanding the situation clearly themselves. Their focus shifts from saving the relationships to protecting their mental stability because emotionally shift is powerful. The emotionally detached people become difficult to control. The empath no longer seeks constant reassurance, no longer argues endlessly for honesty, and no longer sacrifices emotional peace to maintain boundaries quietly, and no emotionally observing from a distance. The more emotionally mature the empath becomes, the less influence manipulation has over them. They start recognizing patterns faster, trusting actions more than words, and valuing emotional consistency over temporary affection. This transformation often shocks the people around them because they were emotionally dependent on the empath's patience, the endless understandings, endless of endability. endless emotional availability. Once the empath mentally disconnects, the emotional environment changes completely. The warmth becomes limited. The emotional access disappears. The reactions stop. And suddenly, the person who felt emotionally powerful begins experiencing insecurity, anxiety, or regret because they can no longer control the emotional atmosphere. What makes this even more significant is that empaths rarely affirm this transformation loudly. They simply become calmer, quieter, and emotionally unavailable to harmful behavior. Their greatest strength becomes emotional discipline. They no longer need revenge, constant closure, or dramatic confrontation. That protecting their peace is more valuable, is multiple than forcing loyalty from people who never respected their emotions in the first place. One of the most psychologically unsettling moments, a person is realizing that an empath they once took for granted has emotionally withdrawn completely. Most people expect revenge to look loud, emotional, dramatic, or destructive. But the true power of an empath appears in the moment they stop emotionally participating altogether. Unlike manipulative individuals who seek control through chaos, guilt, arguments, or emotional games, an emotionally exhausted empath often chooses silence and distance instead. This emotional withdrawal carries a unique psychological weight because the empath was usually the emotional center of the connection. They were the listener during difficult moments, the person who remembered emotional details others ignored, and the one constantly offering reassurance, patience, support, and understanding, even while struggling internally themselves. Over time, many people unconsciously become emotionally dependent on that energy without fully appreciating its value. They grow comfortable receiving emotional loyalty without giving equal emotional safety in return. But emotional access people once had changes permanently. The emotional access people once had suddenly disappears. The empath no longer argues for manipulation, no longer over explains feelings, and no longer sacrifices personal peace to maintain unhealthy relationships. At first, many people misinterpret this silence as temporary anger or emotional stubbornness. They assume the empath will eventually, as before, to the same emotional withdrawal from an empath is rarely love, impulsive. It's usually the final stage of prolonged emotional disappointment. By the time the empath disconnects externally, they've already spent months mentally processing betrayal, disappointment, emotional imbalance, and psychological fatigue internally. This is why our emotionally feel so calm and controlled. They're no longer emotionally fighting for the reality because they've already emotionally accepted its reality. What makes this especially powerful is that absence often reveals emotional value more clearly than presence ever did. While the empath was constantly giving emotional support, many people failed to notice how much emotional stability they were receiving daily. But once that support disappears, emotional emptiness becomes impossible to ignore. Conversation reassurance disappears. Emotional reassurance feels colder. The sense of being deeply understood vanishes. And suddenly, the person who once overlooked the empath's value that the empath had silently carried for years, this creates psychological discomfort. Mikas express spali. Because humans often recognize emotional importance, the empath after losing this assistant becomes a mirror that forces people to confront their own emotional behavior. Selfishness, manipulation, or neglect. And unlike dramatic revenge, detachment leaves no argument to fight against. Because the empath is no longer seeking emotional engagement, they simply move differently. Their energy becomes selective. Their attention becomes guarded. Their emotional investment becomes limited to people who bring peace instead of emotional damage. This transformation is what makes emotionally detached empaths so powerful. They no longer need to prove their worth, demand validation, or force understanding from emotionally careless people. Their calm distance becomes the consequence itself. And for many individuals, realizing too late that they lost someone who genuinely cared for them creates a deeper regret than any confrontation or punishment ever could. Sever emotional pain has the power to permanently transform the whole psychology of an empath, not by destroying their ability to feel, but by changing the way they protect their emotional energy before repeated emotional disappointment. Many empaths naturally with open paths naturally move through life with open trust, emotional generosity, and a strong desire to help patients. Communication, understanding, and loyalty can repair almost any emotional situation because they feel emotions intensely, but because they also tend to give people more chances than most individuals would tolerate. However, repeated emotional wounds eventually force the mind into adaptation. Human psychology is designed for survival. And when emotional pain becomes continuous, the empath slowly develops emotional defense their personality. This transformation is rarely loud or dramatic in the beginning. Instead, it appears through increased observation, emotional caution, and stronger awareness of behavioral patterns. The empath who once ignored red flags now notices them immediately. The person who once over-explained feelings now becomes more selective with emotional expression. The individual who once chased emotional closure now understands that not every person's discontinued access to their energy. Pain sharpens perception. After surviving manipulation, dishonesty, emotional neglect, or betrayal, empaths begin studying behavior more carefully than words. They learn that actions reveal emotional truth more accurately than promises ever can. This creates a new level of emotional intelligence, because suffering teaches lessons that comfort never could. Over time, the empath becomes emotionally disciplined. They stop responding impulsively to every emotional trigger. They become calmer, fake behavior, quieter around fake behavior, and more comfortable walking away from emotionally harmful environments. What surprises many people often makes the empath appear stronger, colder, or more distant, when in reality, they've simply learned the importance of emotional boundaries. They no longer confuse self-sacrifice with love. They no longer believe endless forgiveness automatically creates healthy relationships. And they no longer allow guilt to pressure them into tolerating emotional disrespect. This emotional evolution can feel intimidating to people who once benefited from the empath's unlimited patience, because the empath is no longer emotionally easy to control. They recognize manipulation faster, detect emotional inconsistency earlier, and trust seeking validation from everyone around them. Instead of seeking validation from everyone around them, they begin protecting inner peace as a priority. Their social circle becomes smaller, their trust becomes earned instead of automatic, and their emotional investment becomes highly selective. But this transformation is not bitterness. It's psychological growth created through survival. The empath still cares deeply, still loves deeply, and still possesses emotional sensitivity. But now those qualities are guided by wisdom instead of emotional vulnerability alone. They understand that empathy without boundaries leads to emotional exhaustion, and kindness without self-respect attracts manipulation. As a result, the empath becomes emotionally balanced in a way many people never expected. The pain that was meant to break them ultimately strengthens their emotional awareness, self-control, and resilience. And once an empath reaches this stage of emotional maturity, they become incredibly difficult to deceive, because suffering has already taught them the difference between genuine connection and emotional performance.